Welcome to Beyond the Ballot AZ. I'm your host, Tom Collins, Executive Director of the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission.
And I'm Gina Roberts, Voter Education Director for Clean Elections.
Today, we're talking about the issues that matter most to Arizona going into the 2026 primary election. And Gina, when we say the issues that matter most to Arizona voters, we really mean that.
We do mean that, Tom, especially because, we are talking to voters directly. So when we prepared this survey to go out to voters, we were really thinking, okay, we want voters to be able to tell us very specifically what they care about. And that way we can use that information for our primary reason would be for our candidate debates. So Clean Elections, we're hosting candidate debates for our federal races, our statewide races, and our legislative races. And so I think when looking at the research, it's really telling. So for example, just looking at the area that I live in, I can see that the top issue is inflation and rising prices. But when I look at, let's say, Central Phoenix, there's a 10-point difference where it's maybe, not as important. So that to me is super telling. And I think it really helps those legislative candidates understand what their voters want to hear about.
Right. And it also makes sure that when you're listening to your candidate for legislature or for the governor or any other office, that you know that your views are being reflected or not reflected in what they're saying or how they address the issues that you and your neighbors care the most about. We're here with Mirja Riester, Partner and Chief Strategy Officer at Riester Advertising Agency. Mirja, thanks for joining the show.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
So you were instrumental in pulling together this year's data for Clean Elections. So let's start with the big picture. What were the top issues that are on voters' minds?
When we give folks the opportunity to pick any issues, affordable housing came out on top with 22%, election security second with 21%, and inflation and rising prices with 20%. So those are the overarching big issues when people have the option to select multiple choices.
And of those, the single most important one is inflation.
Correct. So the way we advance when we ask these questions, people have multiple options to select issues, and then we force 3 issues, and then we force the most important.
Yeah.
So if they only had to select one, and that is inflation and rising prices by far.
One of the reasons we do this polling is to get a clear picture of what matters to voters. And the reason we want to know that is because we hope it helps our candidates and focus on voter priorities in our debate program and other places.
Yeah, that's exactly right. With our debates, we don't just, pick and choose ourselves of what we're going to talk about. The debates need to be meaningful for voters and for candidates. And so to understand what is meaningful to voters, that's why we go out there and talk to them directly. So that way, when it comes time to actually be on the debate stage and speak to voters, the candidates know what the voters are caring about. The moderators are making sure to ask questions that are top of mind to voters. And so this poll is very important to the structure of the Clean Elections debates program. But, we always want to make sure that we are confident in the data. So Mirja, can you walk us through what that methodology looks like? How do we know this sample is truly representative of Arizona voters?
Yeah. So we conducted an online survey among 1,632 Arizona registered voters. And we conducted it March 6th through March 20th. And I just as a refresher, the Iran war started February 28th. So that had already happened. It was quite fresh, and not all of the impacts that we're now experiencing are reflected, but it had already occurred. The survey was about 12 to 15 minutes long. We had a lot of very topical questions. And the reason we choose this robust of a sample size, 1632, is it gives us a very low margin of error. And it allows us to really segment and make sure that the sample size stays stable when we go down into looking at the Republicans versus the Democrats versus the independents independents and others. So any type of cross-tabbing that we did, we are always on the safe side and have a really stable, high-quality data reflecting the people's opinions here.
One of the things as we were going through this data, and even as we were, preparing the scripts and the questions, something that stood out to me, and again, this is why I think the sample size is so important too, is so we can see those nuances across responses. But there was a nuance in economic perception. We see that voters overwhelmingly feel like the national and community economy is getting worse, even as a good portion of them say that their own personal finances feel more stable. And I think that tells candidates a lot about where voters' heads are at and where their anxiety is coming from. But I have a question for you, Mirja, on this. Because again, so if voters see that their personal finances feel okay, feel stable, but externally they're seeing that things are getting worse, what role does, I guess, personal behavior play in that? Are people, while it may feel that way, are voters actually adjusting their behaviors to make sure that their finances are stable amidst an economy that they truly think is getting worse?
So this is actually a very common phenomenon in research, and it's called the my side bias, or the personal national gap that occurs. And it is largely driven by people's observation and by the media coverage, and also by the partisan narrative. Even if voters themselves don't necessarily feel that their wallet or pockets are getting tighter, what they hear is what creates their opinion. And it can also create a great deal of economic anxiety. And additionally, what we also find that those folks whose party is not in power increasingly feel that way, that the national economy is worsening, even though their own is not.
So on one issue that we have a lot of polarization and is immigration and immigration enforcement. But then on the other hand, we have some alignment around protecting Arizona's water and land. This survey highlights polarization on an issue basis. How do you sort out the water and land from immigration as which one is going to be partisan polarizing and which one's not?
Yeah, so this data clearly indicated the very partisan lines and the polarization on issues such as immigration and ICE. But surprisingly, and we had a section called Environment and Climate. Very, very interesting that on the notion of land protection and water protection, it's really important for voters across party lines to hear from their candidate a plan on how to continue to preserve specifically water and any water shortages, what the plan is, what the candidate is actually laying out. That was really the most consistent topic picked across party lines from voters.
That's interesting. So, Gina, do you think that candidates will recognize that there's some a place there for some unity or consensus or discussion on water issues?
I hope so. We just put together an Inside the Issues episode about water, and we had some great panelists discuss it. I think, really comes down to, what our plans are for securing Arizona's water future. And I think this is where we can see, our candidates work together across the aisle, right? And come together and speak to this issue, because I'm sure they all have different plans on how we get to a secure future for Arizona with our water supply. The other thing I think candidates will likely be paying attention to, and this poll supports that, is of course the economy, right, and inflation. We always see that, right? And I think in every poll I've ever read, and Mirja, I know you're the expert here, but it's always what comes down to impacting our pocketbooks, right? That people truly care about that. How is this going to affect me personally? How much is it going to cost me just to live? And I think that, our candidates need to have a plan for that and be able to discuss that on the debate stage when they're campaigning. But their constituents are going to want to know, how are you going to make Arizona a better place for me to live, to raise my family when it comes to, affordability?
Yeah, I think it's people want to know, how will you, candidate, help me get ahead? How will you solve the local problems? Water is important. For some, education is important. Election security also, again, important. More and mostly for Republicans this time around when we compare that to 2024. And lastly, also the notion, does the candidate align with my values? That is also something that candidates should consider as they start debating and being out in the community, trying to get voters to support them. Those are really the nuts and bolts of what candidates should respond to.
The poll, it absolutely touches on the issues, on policy issues, right? But it doesn't stop there. We're also asking voters, what do you look for in a candidate? Who is your ideal candidate? And the poll tells us that voters are saying that they want a fighter. They want a candidate who stands up for their values. And so, that's going to be an important display on the debate stage as well, looking at candidates' attitude, their temperament, how they're communicating and attempting to work across the aisle, but also how they're staying true to those values and they're, fighting for their constituents.
So, Mirja, can you touch quickly on how we measured that kind of sentiment and how we measured how voters care about candidates' personality?
Yeah, so this was a question where we asked people to review a series of statements and to indicate their level of agreement or disagreement with that specific statement. And some of the statements were the candidate is open to policies from both parties, a candidate's personality matters as much as policies, wanting a candidate that will fight for my issues, or candidates who collaborate across the aisle and who are not rude. And it's very important for voters that there is a sense of respect and a strong character actually displayed. We do also see that the notion of candidate is a member of my party versus the candidate agrees with me on the issues I care about, that the majority of voters really focus on the latter.
So not everybody can get away with being a jerk as a politician, basically, right? It's not necessarily a transferable skill.
Correct. I recommend not to, because that does matter to folks. Now, I do want to say on the last two comments, it's important to also understand that there is still a great sense of voter tribalism. So while they may agree with the statement when it comes to the ballot box, they might continue, as they have in the past, to support the candidate of their party.
Well, yeah, and that's a really interesting point for Arizona, I think, because we have such a high amount of independent voters. And so while tribalism, of course, makes sense for the political parties that somebody is aligned with, for our over 1 million registered voters, I wonder, where do they fall into? I don't even know how to ask this question. Could tribalism actually impact independent voters?
So the concept of tribalism is really based on this innate need that we have as humans to belong. And so I believe for independents, this will really play out which party provides the stronger psychological security for me as an independent, right? Where do I feel that I belong closer to? And I think it's hard, but when they have to make the decision, there will be nuances, and I think the psychological pull there will play.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Ballot AZ. I'm Gina Roberts.
And I'm Tom Collins. We'll see you next week.